Hello YouTube, Mr. Gibson Guy here. Today we have a special story. We're talking about two military veterans who faced off against each other on the battlefields of two world wars. They've always been rivals, but now they're getting up there. And they're here with me today. Right here. Here we have the Luger P008 9mm, and here we have the Colt 1911 and 45 ACP. Yes, and these are the two veterans, two rivals, who we're going to look at today in this video. This video was inspired by a video I saw from great guy Hickok 45, and I'm sure if you're watching this video you must be familiar with Hickok 45. But he did one turns out a while back, called the Colt 1911 versus the Luger. Good title. That's kind of where this came from. And I watched it, and I was very interested in it, and it brought up a lot of good points. One is the great similarities between these two guns. These were the early adaptations of automatic pistols in military organizations around the world. They were moving beyond revolvers into autoloaders, in entering a new century, and moving into advanced technology and weapons. And that's where they became rivals too. Now, I'll start with the Colt. First of all, Hickok 45 had his own 1911 that he was using, and he didn't give a lot of history on it, but I could tell from looking at it, it looked to me like it was probably a CMP pistol, a civilian marksmanship program, which is an organization that sells surplus military equipment, military guns, to the public. And they continually are in recent years, they've been having sales on clearing out some old 1911s, 45s. And these are guns which were used by the military, purchased by the military. And the government purchased 1911s for the military between the years of 1911, of course, starting date, and 1945, the end of World War II. That was, now these guns were still available, sold to the public, and sold to the police departments, sold to other militaries, but that ended the U.S. contract with them in 1945, and they had enough left over after the World War II to hold them over until mid-1980s when they changed over to the Beretta. Likewise, the P08 Luger 9mm was used in World War I and World War II. At the end of World War II, there were still some that were made for other countries and other customers and for private individuals for a few years before production was stopped. But for the military, for the German military, it was cut off at 45, of course, and they weren't buying any more. So the P08 first appeared, that evolution of the Luger, in 1908, and the 1911, of course, occurred in 1911. Both of them sunset in 1945, so they live virtually the same life expectancy. But the one thing that I was interested in, if I was going to be in a perfect world with this comparison, that Hickok 45 did was that I would say, all right, if you're using a Luger POA that's 100 years old with a 100-year-old magazine, would you also compare it to a 100-year-old 1911 with a 100-year-old magazine? Because I would think if you were comparing the 100-year-old magazine in a Luger with a new Wilson Combat magazine in your 45 automatic, I think it's pretty obvious which gun is going to win every single time. I don't know what the age of the magazines were, but I will point out that Hickok 45 made very clear that he had two magazines with this Luger that he had borrowed from his friend, and one magazine kept jamming continually. The other magazine worked perfectly, and he had no problems with it at all. So it seems that the problems that the Luger suffered was the fault of the magazine itself, not from the gun. The gun was fine. But these guns have always been rivals, and I have recently been trying to study up on the rivalry that they had, the record of it and the history of it, and it's quite a history. One of the things that stood out while I looked into this history was that there was some fishy things going on. The program to determine the fate of what would be the next United States Army sidearm took 13 years to actually be settled. That was a long time to decide on a pistol. But the worst thing is that when you go back and you look into the history, the different accounts, there's a lot of discrepancies in the accounts between what one person claims and another person and another person. And then you watch YouTube videos and somebody's going to report this and somebody else is going to talk about this. And it's very confusing. So I am going to do a little discussion on what I have found out about this as these pistol trials of 1900 proceeded, and see if we can come to some objective truth as to, or at least subjective truth, of how it actually came about. And to start out with, we have to look at just a brief history part of this, and that is the history of Colt firearms in the United States Army. Now, at the time of the turn of the century, 1900, Colt and the U.S. Army had almost 60 years of business experience working together. And that, of course, started out with Sam Colt in the early 1840s when he started producing pistols, his early revolvers to be used in the Mexican War, and continued up through Sam's death in 1862, just after the beginning of the Civil War, and then from then on his company continues on his business practices right up to the beginning of the 20th century. And I say that because Colt was somewhat of an engineer and a designer. He came up with the original rotating cylinder that made a cap and ball pistol capable to shoot 5 or 6 shots instead of just one before you had to reload it. And that was a boon to the pistol and very important in American history. And this guy was a good salesman. He was a mediocre engineer, but he got other people to work with him that did a good job. And he was a really carefully businessman, very business oriented. And he liked to work with lawyers, and he was real good at working with the patent office, and also that, I don't want to say government corruption, but he was very gracious in gifts that he bestowed upon government purchasing agents and upon people at the U.S. Patent Office, and he got a lot of favorable deals that went his way, to the point where it started actually affecting the whole firearms industry, because every time some company would come out with a new idea for how to do something, to improve the design of a firearm, Colt would immediately sue them and shut them down. And so finally it got to where the patent people above the patent office had to say, you got to stop renewing these patents over and over again, because the world is getting ahead of us, because we're stuck with Colt's old stuff. And so finally they started sunsetting some of his patents and let Smith & Wesson get in, and all of a sudden we had metallic cartridges, and Colt ended up getting left in the dust. So there was a lot of shady kind of things going on between Colt and the government. Smith & Wesson sold more to individuals than to governments. Colt worked more towards selling to governments than to individuals. And their fortunes followed that. But that's a different story. But while we're looking at this, Colt was catching up with Smith & Wesson when they finally got bored through cylinders and could put in cartridges of their own. But they wanted to get ahead, and so they started looking at what's new, and somebody told them about a gun designer, engineer, lived out in Salt Lake City, that had been working with Winchester, named John Browning. And so Colt company, not Sam Colt, he was dead by now, but Colt's company got in contact with Browning, and he said, well, why don't you make somebody came with the idea, how about an automatic loading pistol instead of improving a revolver some more? The revolver's gone as far as it's going to go. And they said, this is very interesting. So Colt hired Browning to make them an automatic loading pistol. And right after Colt does that, the Army decides, the Army's tired of revolvers, we need an auto-loading pistol. We'll need to have some trials and get some companies to come up with some examples of them. Let's ask Colt. You see where I'm going here. So right about the time that Colt wants to make an automatic pistol, the government decides it wants to buy an automatic pistol. Huh, what a coincidence. So, let's see here. In 1900, in 1898, the government first starts talking about they want to have some trials. So they start telling some firearms manufacturers that they want them to submit a automatic pistol for a military contract. And they set a date in 1900, we're going to have trials, so get them ready. And so the Army, in preparation, they acquired that, and the numbers differ on which reference we're looking at, but mostly they say 1,000 P00 Lugers, the original ones, which were in 7.65 millimeter, also known as 30 caliber Luger. It's a smaller projectile, smaller bore. And they got 1,000 of those, and they order 475 Colt model 1900s, which is one of their early Colt auto pistols. Not much like this, really. One of Browning's early examples. And so they get those guns and they pass them out, cadets, and they do some field trials on them, and they like them. But the Army has recently been in war, the Spanish-American War, and in the Philippine insurrection. And in the Philippines, dealing with the Moro warriors, they found that their .38 Smith & Wesson and their .38 long Colt arms that they were using in their revolvers didn't have any effect on these big moral warriors who were all high on drugs. And so they said, we need something that's going to be more powerful, because they were making small bore, small cartridges to work in these small automatics. And they wanted something jumbo and more powerful for a handgun, which, if you're the Army, kind of makes sense and think about it. And so they go back and forth on this, because they get some guns that are okay and some guns that are kind of crappy, but they're just worried because they're just little bing bing. So in 1904, the Army convenes Colonel John Thompson and a doctor, Major Louis A. Lagarde, and they do a bunch of ballistic tests on cows and horses and cadavers, dead bodies. They shoot these animals and these dead bodies with various projectiles. And they determined that a minimum of .41 inch is a minimum caliber, preferably a .45 inch, almost a half an inch diameter. Kind of like the end of this. A .45 caliber is what the Army and the military needs for a new sidearm. So that's in 1904. They come to those conclusions, and they contact the Frankfurt. Notice I did not say Frankfurt. This is not in Germany. This is in the U.S. The Frankfurt Arsenal, and contract them to build a .45 caliber cartridge. And they further specify that this .45 caliber cartridge is going to be interchangeable to work in an auto-loading pistol and in a revolving pistol. Yes, both of them. Now, those of us who live on the other side of the 20th century know that doesn't work. But on their side of the 20th century, that was just something the Army could declare and it would work. So, somehow or another, the Frankfurt Arsenal produces the original .45 cartridge, universal for autos and revolvers. And the Army starts sending out samples of these cartridges to different companies so they can make a gun that will fire this bullet. And this is in 1905. They send this out, making the announcement. In January of 1907, 2 years later, they will have the trials to test out what these different companies can produce. So, John Browning gets the new .45 cartridge, and he just furiously goes to work trying to come up with a gun that will work in it. Using his 1905 to try to scale it up to a bigger bore, and Ruger tries scaling theirs up, and Savage tries scaling theirs up, and some other different companies. They have various levels of success or failure. And then something happens, and I'm really surprised that this came not from the Americans, but from the Germans. It seems a little out of character. But the Germans, the Luger company, they make their gun and they can't get it to work. And so what they do is they analyze what's going on with this gun instead of just scaling it up. And they find that in order for a gun to cycle with a cartridge this big, it needs a whole lot more powder than what this cartridge has. So what they want is they want a gun that has heavy enough springs to handle this cartridge, but light enough springs to work with what little bit of power the powder produces. Then of course that's impossible. So while everybody else is trying to adjust their gun to the cartridge, Ruger says, we've got to adjust the cartridge to the gun. Duh. So, 1907 rolls around, well, the end of 1906, because this is right in January here of 1907. George Luger himself shows up with his gun right here, ready for our trials to commence. And Browning shows up. We've got Colt's people, we got the Savage people, we got all these different people bringing in their guns to shoot this round. And George Luger announces to it, you guys were messed up because the cartridge that you made us work with is an impossibility, won't work. And Browning hears this and he says, that's why I couldn't get it to work. And Savage says, we couldn't get it to work. And Georg Luger says, here is the cartridge you all need. That's my German English there. So he hands out the cartridges and they give out the specifications and they tell the Army, you got to do this specification because what you give us doesn't work. They said, it doesn't. We can't make it work. All right, so January goes by. They say, go back to the drawing board. Everybody make cartridges of these specifications, and then we'll come back and get going quick. So the other companies, they make the cartridges, and they're ready to go. When they use the cartridge to the German formula, their guns work. Shazam, I don't know about that. And now I'm going to read to you the account of the trials from two different sources. And you've got some background information, so you kind of get an idea what you're listening to. But listen to the difference of two different accounts of the same thing. Early on, the Luger started out relatively strong. 1,000 were purchased and subjected to an extensive field trial starting in 1902, different year. The results of the trial were promising enough that the Army asked for the Luger in .45 caliber. Georg Luger obliged, producing 3, other sources say 2, .45 Luger prototypes in time for the next round of formal competitive testing by the Board of Officers convened on January 15th, 1907. Convened, they met. That's when Georg came in and said, your cartridge is garbage. You got to do it this way. The actual firing of the testing takes place in March 19th. But we leave that out here. At the 1907 trials, Colt offered a slightly improved Model 1905 with a grip safety designed by Karl Eberts of Colt, while Savage and Luger had their prototype .45s. When the smoke cleared on March 28th, remember we started on March 19th, when the smoke cleared, meaning this report is not going to tell you what actually happened at the trial. We're skipping over that to where the smoke clears. When the smoke cleared on March 28th, the board recommended that 200 each of the Colt and Savage pistols be ordered for field tests. Colt and Savage, no Luger. Remember what we said earlier. On May 18th, Colt enthusiastically accepts its order, while Savage demurred. Consequently, the board turned to the third place finisher, Luger, placing a 200 pistol order with DWM, Deutsche Waffen Munitions, DWM, the Luger's manufacturer. The ensuing price negotiations resulted in an ordinance finally accepting Luger's price structure on October 28, 1907. And then it talks about Savage waited around, and then Luger says, forget it, we got too many orders, we're not doing this stuff. We've been playing around. Remember, George was there when he watched the other guns fail and his gun come in third place. Let's look at a different account of the same trials. The Luger. This is in March 19th here. The assorted colonels, majors, and captains who comprise the review board must surely have been impressed with the physical presence at the trials of Georg Luger, the inventor of the world-renowned self-loading pistol that bore his name. Most of the officers were already familiar with Luger's work, as the Army and Navy had purchased 1,000 Lugers for field trials. Luger personally demonstrated the gun before the board, and using only one screwdriver and 2 drifts, he disassembled, and reassembled the gun completely in just 8 minutes. The gun fairly withstood the firing test. Pay attention here. Having fired 1,022 rounds, more than any of the other competitors. It averaged below the Colt in the number of jams, that's a good thing, and below the Savage in the number of misfires. This is the third place gun. That's why we wait till the smoke cleared. However, the quote-unquote certainty of action, due to its positive spraying action, was a major drawback, compelling the board to return a negative finding on the pistol. I think that means it didn't recoil enough. Is that what they really wanted to say? Well, automatics recoil less than revolvers, and they've been shooting revolvers, so this is like a recoilless pistol. We can't have that. Well, there's more. A major drawback, compelling the board to return a negative finding on the pistol. Additionally, the Luger, here's where our math skills come in. The Luger had been tested using 746 rounds of ammunition prepared by Luger and brought over to the trials. Luger had prepared special hot rounds with a faster burning powder than was currently available in the U.S. On this point, the Army conceded that the Luger worked best with German-made rounds. Now remember the story of the rounds, and remember the number. Luger used 746 rounds that they made in Germany, but the gun successfully fired 1,022 rounds. So that's 375 more rounds, which means that it fired the American copies of the Ruger ammo, which the other companies were using. So the Luger fired them. It beat all the other guns in everything. Recoiled less. It came in third place. So that's why we begin to look at what happened and Colt's history with the Army and their sweet deals that they got. Now, I know a lot of people loved 1911, but I'm just telling us, reporting things that are here. And there's fishy stuff that went on there over 100 years ago. But if we go on with this, the Luger kind of fades into German history and stays out of America, except that a lot of Americans like to buy them as souvenirs. But John Browning keeps working on this. The Savage and the Colt, which proceed on to the trials, are not accepted in 1907 or in 1908 or 1909. Finally, in 1910, Colt, which kept failing, calls the Army back, let's have a new trial. John's got a new one, and it's got a different curve to the handle here. And using Luger designed ammunition, eventually it passes the Army field requirements, finally, after 10, 12 years of development, and is accepted with glowing accolades because this amazing pistol has passed, after all these years, this difficult torture test. And then right after that, the U.S. starts making 1911s and goes to war. And recall that this magnificent 1911 pistol that went off to war actually had a very bad record in World War I. So bad that Colt, immediately at the end of the war, recalls all the pistols, and they have to come up with a whole new version, the 1911A1, which changes a whole lot of stuff with the pistol. Changes a whole bunch of stuff. And eventually they do get it straightened out. But when we look at this and look at the real history, oh, one last thing I have to mention here. It's at the bottom of my notes. And that is that, remember, George Luger was there for these trials in 1907, from January through March, all through the whole thing. And then he's there watching these other guns fail. And then he watches his gun lose and be eliminated. And something really fishy goes on there. These were prototype guns, and they mentioned 3, but there was only 2 that they brought. And that is, immediately after the announcement, the people in charge of the trials order the .45 caliber Luger that was used for the trials and any other existing copies to be immediately destroyed. And Georg sees this corporal walking out with the hacksaw and put their .45 Luger in a vise and tighten it up. And you can just picture him talking to a young assistant. Take our Luger, go out the back door, don't let anybody see you, and don't show me that gun till we're in Berlin. And so the other prototype of the .45 Luger escaped, while the one that won the trials was destroyed by the Army. Just something to think about. One of these does, I think it's in the first article, does say that the .45 caliber Luger that escaped ended up showing up many years later and being sold as the most expensive auto pistol in history because it got away and didn't get hacksawed. Well, that's it for the story of the Luger and the Colt 1911. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Mr. Gibson Guy out.